The iconic ghost town. A haunting reminder in the 21st century of that period in American history known as the Wild West. But what is a ghost town? Philip Varney is the greatest living authority on ghost towns. This definition is widely accepted.
I say that a ghost town is a town that has two basic characteristics. One, its population is markedly lower than it was in its heyday. And secondly, that the reason for the existence of the town initially is no longer the reason why people are there.
Kenneth Jessen is another expert on ghost towns. He sees that finding these relics of a bygone time should be on your must-do list.
And I think the excitement is getting there. The journey is often as exciting as the actual experience of walking around a place where people once lived and children once played and where there was commerce and sales and maybe even a few gunfights.
But how did they come to be in the first place? As the United States population spread west from its original East Coast colonies to the Mississippi River, countless communities, towns, and cities sprang up. Some flourished. Others fell by the wayside and disappeared. The last great westward push toward settling this vast country began after the American Civil War. It was a push into the Great Plains, into the rugged mountains of the West, and into the bleak landscapes of the desert Southwest. It was the era of military forts to fend off Indian raids, of mining camps and towns where thousands hoped to strike it rich. Most of these places were short-lived. They experienced the boom and bust cycle of many mining towns and have been lost to the ravages of time. Others somehow hung on and survived as partial ghost towns. Towns where people still live, such as Silver Plume, Colorado. Towns that have become tourist attractions, including Virginia City, Montana, Bodie, California. And then there are ghost towns like Tombstone, Arizona. Towns where the past comes alive through reenactments. From blacksmith shops to the fabled shootouts of the Wild West. Other old mining towns are flourishing today because of the introduction of gambling. Towns like Black Hawk and Cripple Creek, Colorado. And the infamous Deadwood, South Dakota, where legendary lawman Wild Bill Hickok met his fate. Real ghost towns and abandoned forts are those precious remains of the past that exist today only as shadows of former glories and wicked events. Events that linger at times like haunting ghosts. But why even care about these remnants of time gone by?
Why do people go to ghost towns? I'm going to refer to a friend of mine, a lass who has died, Tony Hillerman, who wrote a preface for my second book. And in it, he said this: "To me, to many of my friends, to scores of thousands of Americans, these ghost towns offer a sort of touching place with the past. We stand in their dust and try to project our imagination backward into what they were long ago. Now and then, if the mood and the light and the weather are exactly right. We almost succeed.
In this program, we're going to visit the historic forts, trails, and battle sites of the Indian Wars. While the saga of mining boom and bust towns was playing out in the deserts and mountains of the great American West, another drama played out in the middle of the country on America's vast plains, at the time known as Indian Territory. It was a drama that included the Santa Fe Trail and Oregon Trail, trails carrying millions of settlers to New Mexico, Oregon, Washington, Utah, and California. It was a drama that saw great battles between the Indian warriors of the Great Plains on one side and settlers in the United States cavalry on the other. And it was a drama that saw the construction of the most iconic building in Western lore, the Cavalry Fort. Forts that today are now ghost forts.
I think forts are very similar to ghost towns, and that's why every book of mine except my Colorado book, every book of mine on ghost towns has included a fort, because I think people who like ghost towns also like, if you will, ghost forts. And I also have found that veterans particularly like historic forts and will travel great distances to see one.
The first of these forts were not military installations, but trading posts, located along the western edge of the Great Plains. These trading posts serviced the mountain men who roamed the Rockies in search of beaver pelts. And they fostered peaceful trading between the Plains Indians and these early pioneers. The history of their founding is an interesting chain of interconnected events. In 1803, America's western boundary was the Mississippi River. That same year, with the scratch of his signature, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the country's size with the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson then sent the celebrated duo of Meriwether Lewis and William Rogers Clark and the Corps of Discovery west along the Missouri River to explore and report back just what it was the fledgling U.S. had acquired. Beyond the Mississippi, the Great Plains was divided into vast territories held by a number of Indian nations. With the horses left behind by the Spanish during the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, a warrior horse culture evolved, which for the first time allowed people to live and flourish on the plains. Skilled horsemen, these Indian nations were able to hunt and move with the limitless herds of buffalo that roamed the entire length of the Great Plains. Sadly, these vast buffalo herds were nearly extinguished in the decades following. Today, if you wish to roam among the buffalo, there are two marvelous places to do so. The herds in and around Wyoming's Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks, and another wonderful free-roaming herd in South Dakota's Black Hills Custer State Park. Originally, these herds of buffalo were controlled on the northern plains by the Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, and in the south by the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, Kiowa, and Comanche. A Upon the news of the riches in furs in the Rocky Mountains, a hardy breed of men from America ventured across the plains and into the mountains. These were the celebrated mountain men. During a brief time in history, they roamed through the length and breadth of the Rocky Mountains, forged new trails west to California and Oregon, and south into New Mexico and the desert Southwest. Working independently or for trading companies such as the legendary American Fur Company founded by America's first millionaire, John Jacob Astor, these mountain men trapped all kinds of wild animals, grizzly bears to fox to otter and mink. But the most sought-after pelt was the beaver, whose soft, waterproof hide made the ideal hat for Easterners and Europeans. Though a mountain man lived a lonely existence, every year from 1825 to 1840, many of them would travel to a meeting place in the Rocky Mountains, known as the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous. Put on by the largest of the fur trading companies, here men could trade their pelts for much-needed supplies of shot, powder, food, and clothing. Today, rendezvous are celebrated annually at a number of historic Mountain Men era forts through the efforts of reenactors. One of these is Fort Bridger in western Wyoming. Here, men, women, and children gather on select weekends and bring to life the times, dress, and crafts of the Mountain Men period. Fort Bridger was built in 1842 on Black's Fork of the Green River by two of the West's most celebrated trappers and trailblazers, Luis Vasquez and Jim Bridger. A natural-born scout, Bridger was the first white man to use the famous South Pass that would become the Oregon Trail for immigrant wagon trains heading west to California and Oregon. Born of French and Spanish immigrants in St. Louis, Pierre Luis Vasquez was one of the Mountain Man era's premier trappers and traders, building trading posts all across the Rocky Mountains. Earlier, he had built one of the 3 forts or trading posts on the eastern edge of the Rockies in present-day Colorado, Fort Vasquez. These trading post forts represented the first economic operations by white people in Indian Territory. Rebuilt on the location of the historic fort, Fort Vasquez, like the other 2 trading posts, is available to visitors today. Vasquez is now a museum with a representative courtyard that gives you a feeling of those earlier times. Fort Vasquez was quickly followed by another fort.
Fort Lupton was rebuilt by the community. You didn't get government money or state money coming in. You had a community effort to reconstruct this enormous fort. The building is just incredible, and they have celebrations there several times a year. And the fur trade is the first blush where we have non-American Indians coming into Colorado and settling. There's no question when you visit these places, you start reading about them, life was a struggle for survival, because what you have here is you have a fortress with a wall around it. There's not enough land inside to raise crops or anything like that. So you've got to either depend on trade, or you have to have some kind of nearby farming, some kind of nearby ranching, just to provide the food for the people living in the fort. And so there's no question when you start reading about Bent and the writings that he has about Bent's fort that this was really a day-to-day kind of struggle. It was a subsistence living. And the fur trade didn't last long. A lot of it was based on harvesting beaver, and beaver pelts were used for hats, and when that fashion died, so did the fur trade.
The granddaddy of all fur trading forts, the fort that survived beyond the Mountain Men era, was Bent's Fort. Founded in 1833, it is now a National Historic Site near the Arkansas River in Colorado.
Bent's Old Fort did not start as a military post. It began actually as a fur trading post. Began by the Bent brothers and Sir St. Vrain, 1833, and it was ideally situated for the confluence of cultures. You had the tribes of the mountain region, the tribes of the Great Plains. You had the Mexican traders coming up from the south, and you had the Americans coming from the east. And this was an ideal situation on the Arkansas River where all these cultures could meet, exchange goods, exchange information, ideas. It was an ideal setting for many years for its proximity to the different cultures.
In fact, George Bent, one of the fort's founders, married into the Cheyenne tribe who they traded with. If you visit today, the Park Service carries on an active living history program that allows you to experience the different cultures that visited and lived at the fort. During the first fort's 16-year history, it was the single major white trading post on the celebrated Santa Fe Trail from St. Louis, Missouri, and the Mexican settlements in present-day northern New Mexico. In 1821, a small group of traders led by the intrepid William Becknell set out from Independence, Missouri in covered wagons to prove it was possible to cross what was known at the time as the Great American Desert. Their destination was Santa Fe, a rich provincial capital of the newly created Mexican Empire. In doing so, they literally laid the tracks in the form of wagon wheel ruts for the Santa Fe Trail.
Santa Fe Trail was absolutely essential to the American economy at the time. This was the pipeline between the American East and the prosperity that was in Mexico. This is where the gold and the silver came from. This was the sort of the pipeline for the furs of the area, for the buffalo hides that were needed. They were all funneled back and forth. The commerce funneled back and forth between the American East and the Southwest. So the protection of the Santa Fe Trail was essential to the American economy at the time.
In order to protect the merchants, traders, and then travelers along the Santa Fe Trail, the U.S. government understood it would need to have a force of soldiers on horseback. In short, they needed a cavalry, first known as dragoons, on the plains equal to the Indian warriors. And they needed places from which the cavalry could operate. Often, at Bent's Old Fort, dragoons are represented among the living history reenactors. The dragoons were the forerunner of America's celebrated frontier cavalry, soldiers on horseback. Organized in 1833, the dragoons were the elite troopers of the frontier army. Their job was to police the western plains. Their weapons were the Prussian-style saber, known as Old Risk Breaker, the muzzle-loading .52 caliber rifle, and a .54 caliber pistol, both of which could blow a hole in a man the size of a melon. They also possessed formidable mountain howitzers. They dressed in flashy, striking uniforms of dark blue with yellow piping, much like those the cavalry would later wear. In 1851, the official uniform was changed to blue with orange trim, no doubt meant to impress the colorfully painted Indian warriors of the plains. On the frontier, there were no buildings or structures to house these troops, so a series of forts had to be built, roughly paralleling the 95th meridian from Minnesota to Texas, a boundary separating Indian territory from white settlement. Typical of these military posts that would become supply depots for the Indian Wars were Fort Omaha, Fort Leavenworth, and Fort Scott. In 1842, Companies A and C of the 1st or 2nd Dragoons were sent to what would become eastern Kansas. Assisted by only a handful of artisans and using local resources, their first task was to build the fort they were to occupy, Fort Scott. The men completed the post in 1846 for a mere $32,000. Like most large military posts on the western frontier, Fort Scott was not enclosed by walls and resembled a village more than a fort. A large parade ground formed the fort's nucleus, and at its center flew the American flag. The parade grounds were ringed by a complement of buildings: officers' quarters, barracks to house the cavalry and infantry, stables for the horses, and an assortment of specialty buildings: guardhouse, blacksmith shop, weapons and munitions storage, bakery, and the quartermaster or supply house. Many of these buildings are well represented today and well worth a visit. Eventually, as raids by the Indians increased, the U.S. military needed to build forts along the Santa Fe Trail in the heart of Indian Territory. One of the most prominent forts along the Santa Fe Trail, Fort Larned, was significant for the role it was to play as a post, a refuge, a supply point, and a distribution center for Indian annuities. Annuities, which were promised in peace treaties to the various tribes, were a kind of bribe to keep the peace. They typically consisted of flour, coffee, sugar, and trade goods, such as cloth, beads, and even arms and ammunition. Also supplied were agricultural implements, which were to be used to teach the Plains Indians farming and to discourage their nomadic lifestyle.
Fort Larned was established at approximately the halfway point on the Santa Fe Trail. It was sort of the overall guardian of the trail. Started out as a post on the Pawnee Fork. The name was changed to Camp Alert after some time, but by 1860 it was designated as Fort Larned after the Postmaster General of the United States. Very, very important post for the protection that it offered to the trail. Originally it was established as sort of a tent and dugout post, but by 1867, when it had its greatest role, that's when the buildings were converted into red sandstone that was quarried nearby. 1867, it had a very important part in the Indian War campaign of General Hancock in Kansas. This is where he, Custer, with the 7th Cavalry, were originally set up to have discussions with the Indian chiefs of the area. When that conference didn't come about, that's when the Indian Wars on the Kansas prairie began.
This conflict with the Southern Plains Indians, the Kiowa, Comanche, Arapaho, and Cheyenne, became an all-out war in 1864, leaving behind numerous battlefield sites available for visitors today. It started near Fort Larned, Kansas, when the Cheyenne chief Lean Bear, just back from a historic meeting with Abraham Lincoln, was gunned down by troopers as he approached, showing the peace medal given to him by the president. Using this attack as an excuse, the Cheyenne Dog soldiers made settlers in Kansas and eastern Colorado pay a heavy price. As a result, a military operation was mounted by the 3rd Volunteer Colorado Cavalry, led by Colonel John Chivington, to attack Chief Black Kettle Cheyenne village at Sand Creek on November 29, 1864. It would become known as the Sand Creek Massacre, a place that is now a historical monument.
Colonel Chivington, who had been at the Camp Weld Council in Denver in September '64, learned at that meeting that the Indians that he had been hunting for and hoping to kill for several years were probably camped at the Fort Lyon area or on the Big Sandy Creek nearby. In mid-November, he left Denver with his troops, headed downriver down the Arkansas to Fort Lyon, which he reached on the night of November 28th.
On November 28th, now in command of 700 troops, armed with short-barreled carbines and pistols and with 4 12-pound mountain howitzers, Chivington ordered his cavalry to march to Black Kettle's encampment.
There were probably 115, 120 teepees here with maybe 500 men, women, and children. Chivington approached from the south, approached the village. Some of the Indians actually went out to meet him. As a matter of fact, some of the first casualties of the fight here were 2 Colorado troopers who were shot down off of their horses. There was no mass charge through this village. Chivington had dismounted his men, and they actually walked through the village, allowing the Indians to escape up creek and a little bit more to the northwest up the creek. The soldiers walked through the village. When they got to the far end, they saw the Indians fleeing, and it was at that time that many of the officers lost control of their men. And the men, almost on an individual basis, started going after the fleeing Indians. They chased them up creek for several miles. As they ran, the Indians dug in at points all along the creek bed, dug themselves homemade rifle pits to make little defensive positions. The soldiers chased them throughout the rest of the day on the 29th. The battle lasted from dawn up until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So it was quite a long, drawn-out affair. There were quite a few casualties, more than we would think of. The soldiers took 76 casualties. That was about 25 killed and 51 wounded, which may not sound like a lot, but in the context of the Indian Wars, that was a heck of a fight. That was put Sand Creek up at the top of all the fights in the Indian Wars as per casualties. As for the Indians, that was pretty devastating to them also. They lost probably upwards of 150 killed. The things that distinguished Sand Creek here was afterwards, after the battle, the atrocities. Some of the men again lost control. They no doubt were angry. They had known what had happened through the rest of the summer with the Indian raiding, the massacre of the Hungate family in June outside of Denver, and the soldiers were taking vengeance. They had scalped and mutilated a lot of the Cheyenne bodies after the fight. I no doubt they saw this as a just vengeance and a great victory. For the Cheyennes, of course, they view the event as a massacre.
Miraculously, Black Kettle survived, even while returning to save his wounded wife. However, Chivington's massacre at Sand Creek elevated the Cheyenne military societies, particularly the Dog Soldiers, into power. Americans back east were horrified by the Sand Creek Massacre. Lincoln removed Governor Evans, and 2 months after Sand Creek, Chivington was out of the service. Black Kettle's peace attempts had failed, and now the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux, enraged by Sand Creek, chose to make war to the knife. Other historic battles soon followed, particularly with a group of impressive Cheyenne warriors led by the famed war chief Roman Nose. During the spring and summer of 1868, Roman Nose led his men in raids against the whites. Eventually, Cheyenne chiefs Tall Bull and White Horse and their followers joined him. To find these raiders, the Army created a special company of 50 rough frontiersmen, known as Forsyth's Scouts. On September 17th, the scouts trailed the Indians to the Arickaree Ford of the Republican River. At this place, called Beecher Island, a great battle took place.
The fight was a result of Indian raids that had been taking place in north central Kansas throughout the summer of 1868, and a civilian force under Major Sandy Forsyth was organized and decided to trail the Indians. They went through western Kansas for a few weeks until they came on a big trail, which led them here to the Arickaree Fork of the Republican. And here they found about bit off a little bit more than they could chew. The scouts were on the north side of the creek when that morning of the 17th they discovered a few Indians trying to steal their horses. The few Indians turned out to be about 500, and Major Forsyth told the scouts, let's get ourselves across the river and onto this little sandy island that was in the middle of the Arickaree down in that area. They dug themselves into the sand, killed some of their horses, and very soon the Indians accommodated them by charging down on them. The Indians would have come out from up creek a little farther in this area here. There was a canyon behind where they massed some of their charges, and that first day there were 3 or 4 major charges. They were some of them led by Pawnee Killer, led some of the Lakotas. Tall Bull was here of the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, Bull Bear. They made several charges down the Arickaree against the dug-in scouts on what would become known as Beecher Island. That was for Lieutenant Frederick Beecher, who was killed here. Throughout the day, about the only things that was saving the scouts was their Spencer repeating rifles. Finally, at the end of the day, Roman Nose showed up, who was one of the famous warriors, leaders of the Elkhorn Scrapers Society. And they said, Roman Nose, where have you been? Well, Roman Nose has, throughout this day, knew of the fighting, but his medicine was broken. Roman Nose had the day before eaten in a Sioux camp, and he had been given fried bread with a wooden, or rather an iron utensil, which he couldn't do. He was only supposed to eat with wood, and he knew that was going to break his medicine. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, Roman Nose decided he's going to have to fight, even though he knew he would be killed. Roman Nose gathered up one of the final charges of the day. Probably 50 yards or so short of the island, the Spencers rang out again. Roman Nose went down, hit several times. The scouts had survived the day. The warriors had found Roman Nose and taken him back to give him proper burial.
With Roman Nose dead, most of the Cheyenne now headed south to be with Black Kettle. But within a year, a few dog soldiers under the leadership of Tall Bull came north again. In the spring of 1869, they ravaged the Saline and Solomon valleys in north central Kansas, murdering settlers and capturing women and children. This time, the Army pursued them relentlessly, attacking the Cheyenne wherever they could catch them, and forcing them to stay constantly on the run. On July 11, 1869, Major Eugene Carr and 250 soldiers caught up with the elusive Cheyenne here at Summit Springs, south of Sterling, Colorado. Perhaps the greatest vestige of the era of the Santa Fe Trail is Fort Union. It is a must for all ghost forts aficionados.
Fort Union is here to commemorate, to memorialize, to remember maybe a period in history that dated from about 1851 until 1891. Fort Union was established as one outpost along the Santa Fe Trail as a way of protecting travelers on the trail, as well as just providing general protection for what was then the ultimate western frontier.
Fort Union National Monument lies at the junction of the Santa Fe Trail and its Cimarron Cutoff. The monument contains the greatest and largest ruins of the American Republic. Like the castles of Europe and the pyramids of Egypt, the ruins here are cloaked in mystery. What long ago undiscovered events transpired here? Who stood by these buildings 150 years ago? What ghosts of the Old West hide in these corners? As the sun sets low in the west, every angle and shadow of the fortress ruins stirs the soul and imagination. Like all military posts of the Great Plains, Fort Union was unwalled. An open collection of buildings made of reddish brick and stone surrounding a parade grounds. Officers' quarters, barracks for the men, corrals for the horses, prison, storehouses, and bakery. But Fort Union was more than just a military post. It was the central supply depot for all military operations in the Southwest. And during its time, it contained the largest hospital west of the Mississippi River.
Now, after 1846, after the Mexican War, it became the responsibility of the American government to provide protection to this part of the country. And they did that by bringing in troops and stationing them in various villages around the Southwest in what's now New Mexico. That became economically unsupportable, very expensive to house these troops in these small villages. So they started looking at the potential of actually opening forts. And that's what led to the establishment of Fort Union in 1851. From about 1851 until the start of the Civil War, in 1861, the fort actually existed at a location about a mile to the east of us here, over near the ridge which is behind me. So in 1861, a second fort started to be constructed, and that was an earthen fort built on a French design that later came to be known as the Star Fort.
Most of the officers manning the fort during the first phase of the Civil War resigned and joined the Confederacy, including Henry Hopkins Sibley, who led the ill-fated Confederate march into the desert Southwest. His Confederate soldiers were routed by Union forces, including men from Fort Union, at Glorietta Pass in 1862. In 1863, construction of the fort, which is currently preserved at the Fort Union National Monument, began. At the same time, the troopers at Fort Union turned their attention to the Southern Plains Indians. Fort Union's troopers fought heroically with Colonel Kit Carson against the Navajo, and later against the Comanche and Kiowa in the pitched battle at Adobe Walls in 1864. In 1868, Fort Union's cavalry took part in the Army's winter campaign against the Comanche, ending a 5-year battle for control of the Southern Plains. In 1891, the fort was abandoned, becoming a ghost fort. To the north, other famous stories of Indian wars, forts, and battle sites center around the historic Oregon Trail. The years are 1841 to 1869. And for the 500,000 immigrants traveling the Oregon Trail, after days of walking the flat, dusty plains, suddenly, arising out of a mystical cloud, a pinnacle emerges. Whether seen through a morning fog or silhouetted against the setting sun, Chimney Rock signals that Mitchell Pass and the gateway to the mountainous part of their journey lies just ahead. The V-shaped Mitchell Pass is the centerpiece of Scotts Bluff National Monument. It is a historic site dedicated to the Oregon Trail. The trail is the story of the American dream and manifest destiny. It is the story of courageous immigrants. It is a story laid out in the ruts their wagon trains left 150 years ago in the prairie's sandstone bedrock. It is the story of the Pony Express. It is the story of settling the American West. Next to the founding of the nation and the writing of the Constitution, the history at Scotts Bluff National Monument captures the essence of the formative American spirit, called manifest destiny. the near-religious belief that Americans were destined to settle the wilderness from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean in order to create a great new country. A country based on the common man's ownership of land and his hard work. To fulfill this belief, 500,000 Americans sold everything, bought a team of oxen or mules, packed their belongings and food into a covered wagon, and began walking the nearly 2,000-mile trip from the Missouri River in Kansas to their final destinations in present-day Oregon, Utah, or California. Collectively known as the Overland Trails, these routes were also known by their particular destinations: the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, and the California Trail. From Mitchell Pass, it would be another 500 miles until the wagon trains would split into the separate trails that would lead to their respective destinations. But the trail is truly a ghost trail. It is estimated that 50,000 men, women, and children died or simply disappeared pursuing the American dream.
So you could have, based on Ford estimates at Fort Laramie and Fort Kearny, anywhere between 300 to 600 wagons a day coming down through here through this pass. And it literally would be covered with dirt and dust, and you probably couldn't even see down below to the ground because of the amount of dirt. There's even one account of a child being lost in the dirt, and they never do mention if they find her, but you could actually just get lost in this little narrow area traveling with your group.
Paralleling the Oregon Trail was the Mormon Trail. Often traveling on the north side of the Platte River, the poorer Mormon families used their men to pull carts carrying their goods on their way to Utah. For 18 months, the Oregon Trail and its branch into California was also the route of the Pony Express rider. From 1860 to 61, these daring and flamboyant men carried the mail and the communications between the Union Army in the East and the troops stationed in California during the beginning of America's Civil War. Of the original 184 Pony Express stations, many are still preserved, such as the one at Gothenburg, Nebraska. Erected on the Oregon Trail in 1860, the original station was a two-story building with horse stables and a fur trading post. Sometimes at twilight, visitors swear they can hear galloping hooves far off in the distance, and the phantom of Billy Tate, a 14-year-old Pony Express rider killed by Indians, announcing, "The mail is coming." Just off I-80, the Gothenburg station is well worth a visit.
The Oregon Trail initially had very little problems along the Great Plains. Treaties had been negotiated with the Plains Indians as the Oregon Trail was coming through. The treaties, for the most part, were held to by both sides. You had occasional incidences where wagon trains would be held up a little bit for more like a toll-taking exercise, when they'd be given like sugar and clothing and bacon and sent on their way. And you really didn't have a lot of use for forts at that time. There was Fort Kearny on the Platte River, and there was Fort Laramie at the North Platte River.
But that changed on August 7, 1864, when the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors launched full-scale attacks on stage stations, ranches, and wagon trains along the Oregon Trail, hitting nearly every station for 400 miles from Julesburg, Colorado, to Big Sandy, Nebraska. The most severe attacks were along the upper Little Blue River portion of the Oregon Trail, where about 100 people were killed. Periodically, near Oak, Nebraska, the attacks on and near the Oak Grove station are reenacted. On August 9, 1864, a suspiciously friendly party of some 20 Cheyenne dog soldiers and Sioux warriors casually paid a visit to the station. Then struck suddenly, killing 2 men and wounding 2 more. 11 ranch workers fled into the ranch house, and another escaped into a grove of trees. But the worst of the surprise raid occurred a short distance from the station at a place called the Narrows. Here the Eubanks families were attacked and 7 killed. Mrs. Eubanks, 2 children, and Miss Laura Roper were taken prisoner. Following the attacks, travel ceased on the trail for 2 months. The U.S. military needed to respond, and it did so by expanding and building up its fort complex. 2 forts, pivotal in the Northern Indian Wars, were along the eastern edge of Indian Territory. Fort Omaha, and the fort still in operation today, Fort Leavenworth. Established in 1827, Fort Leavenworth at Leavenworth, Kansas, is the oldest active Army post west of the Mississippi. Known for its role in the Indian Wars, its most important role began in 1881, when General William T. Sherman established the School of Application for Cavalry and Infantry. That school evolved into the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College.
One of the great posts of the Great Plains. It is still, of course, very active today. It's the home of the Command and General Staff College for the U.S. Army. This is where all the great generals come. And all the great generals of American history passed through here. Grant and Lee, Kearny, John C. Fremont, Douglas MacArthur, Patton, Custer was here, Schwarzkopf, Colin Powell. They all came through Fort Leavenworth. This is the school for generals.
When you go to the fort, there is a historical district located near the Missouri River.
Good number of historic buildings still at the post. I believe there's more than 200 in the historic district, 67, I believe, from the Indian Wars period. Good number of the buildings were active at the time, still actively used today. One of the interesting buildings, it's not open to the public, but it's the original post sutler's quarters. The sutler was the civilian who sold supplies to the men that they couldn't get through the army, and he had a very large house on the post. This is where the commander of the Department of the Missouri stayed. This is where General Hancock stayed. This is where General Sheridan stayed. This is where General Custer stayed during his court-martial at Fort Leavenworth. Sheridan had offered up the home to Custer and his wife to stay there during his court-martial here.
Fort Leavenworth has a reputation as the most haunted fort ever in the U.S. military.
There are many, many ghost stories associated with Fort Leavenworth. One of them concerns actually the wife of Phil Sheridan, who presumably died at the post settlers' quarters, the post commander's headquarters at Fort Leavenworth. And supposedly guests of the home can hear beds stomping upstairs and hear other creaking going on. It's supposed to be Mrs. Sheridan in agony over having died young and her husband marrying somebody else.
The jewel of the northern system of forts was not built, but acquired. It was Fort Laramie in eastern Wyoming. Fort Laramie started out as a trading post for trappers and Indians. In 1849, the Army's Adjutant General, Roger Jones, directed that a post be established at or near Fort Laramie. Rather than build a new fort, the Army purchased the trading post from Bruce Husband, agent of the American Fur Company, for $4,000. Immediately, the Army began refitting the old trading fort as an Army post. By winter, officers' and soldiers' quarters, a bakery, and stables had been completed, and Fort Laramie began its 40-year role as a command post deep in the heart of Indian Territory. Fort Laramie quickly became the most famous, and some even say the most infamous post on the western frontier. For the over 350,000 travelers on the Oregon and Mormon trails, it was the lone beacon of civilization between east and west. Since its founding as a trading post in 1834, the list of those who entered the storied fort read like a who's who of the Old West. Famous trappers and mountain men: James Beckworth, Thomas Fitzpatrick, Jim Bridger, Kit Carson and the ill-fated Donner Party, whose members would later eat each other, passed through in 1846. Brigham Young leading his Mormons to Utah. Top military commanders: William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Sheridan, George Crook, and William Harney. Many of the famous chiefs of the northern plains spent time at the fort as well, along with a cast of colorful western characters: Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, and Wyatt Earp. Less famous, though perhaps more important, were the troopers who manned the fort on a daily basis. Over its active 40-year history, units from nearly every cavalry and infantry regiment that fought in the Indian Wars served at the fort.
Today's Fort Laramie, that was part of the advantage in being in a remote spot. With the railroad not coming through, it wasn't a part of Wyoming where people generally wanted to settle. So the buildings, for the most part, were left alone. Usually when forts are abandoned, that's when nearby townspeople, if the buildings aren't sold to them, people will come in and strip them of building materials. If they're able to, they'll lift the entire building and move it into town where it would be needed. Fort Laramie, because of its remote location, the buildings were left alone, and it actually became one of the best preserved forts. By the time the state of Wyoming took an interest in it, there was about 12 to 13 buildings that still remained at the fort. Then it was taken over by the federal government and became part of the National Park Service in 1938. And today it's still, it doesn't have half of the buildings that it originally had, but it is still a remarkable image of what a Plains Indian Wars fort was like with the restoration of the buildings that are there today.
People with paranormal sensitivity have found Fort Laramie particularly disturbing. In particular, when visiting the captain's quarters and Old Bedlam, where many ghost sightings have been reported. It was from Fort Laramie during the summer of 1866 the U.S. military marched north along the eastern edge of the Bighorn mountain range. This push to build forts along the Bozeman Trail would result in what would come to be known as Red Cloud's War, a war with some of the most historic battle sites in the West. Not far from this reconstructed Fort Phil Kearny in northern Wyoming, the U.S. military experienced its worst defeat in the Indian War to date. It was reconstructed because Indians under the leadership of Red Cloud and Oglala Sioux burned down the original after its abandonment, along with other forts on the Bozeman Trail. The disaster occurred here at the site of this monument. In December of 1866, snow was on the Bighorns. It was a gloomy day and woodcutters were gathering the necessary fuel for the fort's operations. Suddenly, the woodcutters came under attack by a small Sioux raiding party. When word of the attack reached the fort, its commander, Colonel Henry B. Carrington, 18th U.S. Infantry, sent Captain William J. Fetterman to protect the woodcutters and the wagons. Carrington ordered Fetterman not to pursue the raiding party, as this was a common ambush tactic used by the Indians. However, Fetterman ignored his orders and chased after the raiding party. He chased the party over this ridge into a trap. On what would become known as Massacre Hill, upwards of 1,000 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors rose up from hiding and attacked the patrol. Fetterman's command of 81 men was completely wiped out. Fetterman and another captain, Frederick H. Brown, reportedly shot each other simultaneously in the head at the end of the battle. The Indians had lost 63 warriors with nearly 100 wounded. Ironically, 2 civilians using repeating Henry rifles killed and wounded most of these Indians. The leader of the ambush was a Minneconjou Sioux, Chief High Backbone. The battle also launched the military career of the famous Sioux warrior Crazy Horse. When the battle was over, as Chivington's men had done to the dead Cheyenne at Sand Creek, the Sioux mutilated Fetterman and his men, scalping, hacking off limbs, and disemboweling the dead soldiers. A tough winter followed for the troops at Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith, Fort Reno, and Fort Laramie. The Indians, expecting the usual retaliation, dispersed, but when none materialized, they resumed raiding forts along the Bozeman Trail. Then, on August 2, 1867, the wagon box fight took place. This battle contained a tactical lesson for Red Cloud's army.
They removed the wagon boxes from the running gear, or the chassis if you prefer, of the wagons, and arranged these in an oval into which they herded the livestock at night to protect them from Indian depredations. On the morning of August 2nd, 1867, probably about 7 to 8 o'clock, the defenders at the wagon box corral and the woodcutters and their escorts in the various cutting areas around the corral, probably anywhere from a half a mile to a mile distant, were attacked by a large body of mainly Sioux warriors. In the fight that ensued for the next several hours, the defenders positioned inside the wagon box corral were able to very successfully repel 3 or possibly even 4 assaults by the Indian warriors. The advantage that the defenders brought to this particular fight was the Springfield Allen breech-loading rifle with which they had been recently issued. What the Springfield Allen breech loader, the advantage of that is that the top of the breech is opened and a cartridge is inserted into the chamber. The breech closed, the weapon is cocked, and then fired. As opposed to the muzzle loading weapon, where the bullet and the powder have to be inserted into the barrel of the weapon, rammed home, and then the weapon is cocked and fired. So the breech loading weapon meant that the defenders were able to put out a heavier volume of firepower than they would ordinarily have been able to do. And the Indians found this disconcerting and were unable to overcome it. A relief column arrived from the fort about 1 o'clock, 1:30 perhaps, and the Indians dispersed upon the arrival of the relief column. The Indian casualties ranged probably the 50 to 60 casualties is the most accurate. Army casualties, there were 3 killed and 2 wounded.
Eventually, this war would lead to the West's most sacred battle site. In 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills of Wyoming and South Dakota. Once again, miners rushed into what was the heart of Sioux territory. By now, many of the earlier war chiefs, like Red Cloud, had settled into reservation life. However, led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, Many other Sioux continued their ways of hunting and raiding off the reservations. At the beginning of 1876, the roving bands of Northern Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho, and Sioux were ordered back onto the reservations. When they failed to report, all-out war was declared by the U.S. military. In overall command were Generals Sheridan and Sherman. In the field were General George Crook and Lieutenant Colonel Custer. At first, this last phase of the battle for the northern plains went well for the Indians. At the Battle of the Rosebud, Crazy Horse dealt General George Crook his only defeat in the Plains Indians War. Then came the most famous battle in all of the Indian Wars, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. On June 25th, leading the 7th Cavalry, Custer, under orders to seek out and attack any Indians he found, got word of a Sioux encampment along the Little Bighorn River in southern Montana. But it was not a simple village. In reality, it held nearly 8,000 Indians and over 1,500 warriors gathered for their annual Sundance Festival. During the festival, Sitting Bull danced, bled himself, and stared at the sun for 3 days and then had a vision. Soldiers falling from the sky. A voice cried out to him, saying, "I give you these because they have no ears." Sitting Bull interpreted his vision to mean a great victory over the white soldiers. In a classic attack maneuver, Custer split his force of 617 soldiers, 30 scouts, and 50 civilians, sending Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen to encircle the camp in order to crush the Indians in a pincer movement. But Reno was repulsed, and Benteen never joined up with Custer. The daring lieutenant colonel was left alone as he charged the village. Without any support, Custer broke off his attack and raced for a nearby hill. There, he waited for Reno and Benteen to appear. This decision proved fatal. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors took the initiative, encircling Custer and his troops. The Indian circle grew tighter. Crazy Horse led several daring charges through the soldiers' lines, killing a number of Custer's men. As the battle wore on, Custer's hopes of reinforcement faded. Finally, at what was to be called Last Stand Hill, Custer and all of his men were killed as the Indians refused to accept surrender. Today, the Little Bighorn battle site is a national monument with commemorative markers indicating where Custer and his troops fell. There are many historic forts and battle sites all across the southern and northern Great Plains. Many are well preserved, while others are represented by a simple marker. And some have nothing at all. But every site is a powerful reminder of the longest war in American history. The Great Plains Indians War. A war in which thousands lost their lives. And at every site, ghostly hauntings of those who died linger for the intrepid visitor to discover and relish.